Our last week of the series, Staying in Love. If you've missed part of it, all the sermons are on our website, emmettnaz.org. We've really tried to stay very practical in our conversations about relationships over the last few weeks, and maybe that's your biggest takeaway. Maybe the big takeaway for you is that the Bible is so relevant to our lives. It's just amazing to think about a book that's over 2,000 years old, and it's still speaking. God can use it to transform our lives. Maybe it would be an opportunity to be encouraged to continue that study, continue spending time in the Word and listening to God's voice into your everyday lives. Let's just do a little review. The question that started this whole series is the Juno question, and it's pretty much this: is it possible for two people to fall into love and then to stay in love forever? As you look around at your circumstances, as you look around at the world today, you may be tempted to say, well, no, that's not possible, right? Or at least it's not very probable. Maybe we can stay together. I mean, it's hard enough to do that, but to stay together and stay in love, well, that's just a whole nother thing. Good luck with that, right? But it is what we want, isn't it? It's what we want in our relationships. That's what we want. And so how do we, against all the odds, pull this off? How do we stay in love forever? In the first week, we said if you want to fall in love and stay in love forever, the first thing you've got to figure out is how to make love a verb, right? We listened to Jesus speaking to us as our marriage counselor, and he said, don't just, have love be a noun that you fall into, but actually make it a verb. Something that you do from this point on. And we talked about what that verbing love looks like. It involves this, bad word, this 5-letter word, 6-letter word, let me count the letters. 6-letter word, submit, right? That's not a word that we like all that much, but mutually submitting to each other is one of the keys to staying in love. Me submitting to you, you submitting to me. The second week, we talked about the model of love that we have in Jesus, the way that he loved us. And that's just really important for us to see that kind of love, right? And he taught us in Philippians chapter 2, through Paul's teaching, we looked at how he taught us to value others above ourselves, that we should be interested in the things that they are interested in. And this is what he did for us, right? And this is part of staying in love. That's the model that loving one another, the Jesus way to marriage, right? Last week we said that we've got to pay attention to our heart. I introduced you to a mug, and it's Mug, Mr. and Mrs. Mug, if you remember that. And we discovered last week that all of us have stuff in us, right? And when we get bumped, it comes out. And we generally get bumped the hardest when we're in deeper relationships, when we're in romantic relationships. That's when the junk just starts flying, right? And part of staying in love is learning to determine what's in me that I brought into the relationship and not always blaming it on the other person, right? It's part of the conversation. So have you been paying attention to your pink beads and your blue beads and seeing which ones is causing what, right? What have you brought into the relationship? Have you claimed your own baggage? Maybe the most important part of that whole conversation last week is that we realize that we all have baggage, right? And that we should be patient with each other as we try to work through it. Maybe we remember that the goal, again, is not to be right or even to get our way, but our goal is to stay in love. And that should be a barometer for a lot of things, right? Today, as we close out, I want to ask you and talk to you about a decision that everybody who is in love makes often. In fact, probably every day. And it's a decision that we're not aware that we're making. And hopefully, as we work through this conversation, that you will see that you're making this choice and actually be a little bit more intentional about how you answer the question, right? And it's such a big decision that the way you approach this choice will ultimately determine whether you stay in love. Now, I'm obviously building this up pretty big, right? And that's actually been true of every week. This is all important stuff. And we've also said that all the things that we've talked about, we do intuitively when we fall into love, right? We were living that way when we fell into love, but we kind of grew out of the habit. We kind of let things drift along, and then we end up undermining our own relationships, shooting ourselves in the foot, so to speak. So will you turn with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 13? 1 Corinthians 13 this morning. Does anyone know what 1 Corinthians 13 is referred to as? The love chapter. You guys all know that. You guys get an A+. Now we've been kind of taking turns, allowing different people to be our marriage counselors or relationship counselors. We've had Jesus do it. We've had Paul do it. We've had Solomon do it. And now we're going to return to Jesus. We're going to let Jesus have Paul actually have the last word. And Paul puts together in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 a really good list, right? It's a really good list for any relationship. He's really talking about relationships in general, not just romantic relationships. It's good advice for every relationship that we have. But again, we're going to focus primarily on romantic relationships this morning. In fact, you probably, if you're married, you had a part of this read to you, right, as part of your wedding ceremony. And we're going to kind of read through the first part of the chapter, beginning, I think, with verse 4, and then we're going to kind of lead up to verse 7, and then we'll dig into verse 7, which is where the important choice comes in. So just evaluate yourself as we read through this kind of checklist, beginning with verse 4. 1 Corinthians 13, verse 4 says, love is patient. We could probably stop there, right? You got that? Can you check that box off? Patience is probably an important part of, a good relationship, right? How about the next one? Love is kind. That kind of seems obvious, but sometimes we need to be reminded about that, right? We need to be kind to each other if we're going to love each other. How about it does not envy? That makes sense, right? I mean, we really shouldn't resent our loved ones for getting blessed, right? Why would we resent them for something good that happens in their life? And that's kind of what envy's doing, right? We should be excited for them when the good things happen. It does not boast. It is not proud. Those two seem to go together for me, and we've talked about pride a little bit. Pride's pretty difficult on relationships because when you think that you're better than the other person or smarter than the other person, you usually get yourself in trouble, right? So if you're going to check that one off, you got to think about that. How about this next one? It does not dishonor others. Some translations have this, it is not rude. Is that a good idea? Yeah, that's a pretty good idea. I mean, this is all pretty self-explanatory stuff. I mean, if you're in a relationship, you probably don't want to be rude to each other, although I've seen that happen. So think about that. Hopefully you can check that off and be processing through that. How about it is not self-seeking? Self-seeking, that works against love, doesn't it? What do I need to be instead? We've talked about this. I need to be a servant. I need to worry about her needs and let her worry about my needs. It's kind of the mutual submitting thing. This is something that I personally have to work out a lot because I'm really good at thinking about me, being interested in the things that I'm interested in, but it's much more difficult for me to be seeking out what's best for Wendy. How about the next one? It is not easily angered. Okay? We've talked about anger. Anger comes back to really being a control issue, a fear issue. There's some things going on, and we really have to pause and think through that. Why am I angry? What's going on? Pink beads, blue beads, that kind of conversation, right? Anger can come up, especially in romantic relationships. They are especially charged, right, with emotion. And here's a big one. It keeps no record of wrongs. Some of us are really good at that one, right? I mean, if you know, I know that my mom and dad are even really good at that. Maybe your parents or your grandparents, or you've probably seen this modeled. You know, something happens, they get a bump, and then maybe mom or dad ends up saying, they open up the mental file drawer, and they start picking things out. Back in April 13th, 1973, you did this to me. You ever had that happen? That's fun. That is how to have a great relationship right there. It's amazing what people can remember, right? She kept score. We shouldn't keep score. That's not a good way to go with a relationship. It keeps no record of wrongs. Verse 6, love does not delight in evil, but rejoices in the truth. Do you camp out at losses, or do you celebrate the wins? We really shouldn't be focusing on the losses, right? We've got to be focusing in on good things. So really, all this up to this point, this is a pretty easy checklist, right? Maybe not so easy. It makes sense. It's a logical checklist, but it takes some work to actually pull off. Makes sense. And if you really want to have this long-term in-love relationship, that's a great list, isn't it? Really good one. And then Paul gets to verse 7. Now, I have to admit to you that I would read verse 7 growing up, or maybe even as I was a young adult, and I'm thinking to myself, I'm not really sure this is good advice. In fact, I've encouraged people to do the opposite of what Paul's saying here, and I know it's the Bible, and I need to take it seriously, but I don't know for sure about this. Just doesn't seem to make any sense. But what I discovered later is that Paul, in verse 7 of 1 Corinthians 13 here, the Apostle Paul, he's trying to make 4 statements, and he's saying them together, and he's trying to bring them together into one really strong statement, okay? And the 4 things work together. They're not meant to be kind of separated out, but really works together. Paul's getting at one of the most important habits, the most important practices in a love relationship. And this is how he says it. Verse 7, talking about love. It always protects, it always trusts, it always hopes, it always perseveres. It always protects, it always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. In the New American Standard, it says, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Now again, to be honest with you, when I read the phrase, always trusts or believes all things, I just want to think, well, wait a minute. Isn't that making love blind? I mean, what if there's evidence to the contrary? I mean, do you expect me to just say, yes, dear, whatever you say, I believe you, I trust you, even though it doesn't seem to be true? It believes all things. When you pull that one out by itself, I don't know, it just seems to be, maybe you're thinking this too, isn't that what codependent people do? Isn't that kind of unhealthy? Haven't you talked to someone and you've actually said the words, you really need to face reality, you need to look this over? That seems to be the opposite of what's being communicated here. But Paul is trying to give us this invaluable principle, and it's not coming through one of the phrases, but all of them together. So kind of hang out with me here for just a moment. In fact, for the next few minutes, we're going to have kind of a conversation around what Paul is saying here, and then we're going to come back and look at the verse one more time. So I've got these easels here that are going to help me see if I can flip these around. I think you'll relate to this, okay? Wendy made some beautiful signs for me, so I got to take advantage of these. Okay? So in every relationship, at some point along the way, there is a gap between what we expect, our expectations, and the behavior, right? What actually gets done. You believe that to be true? There's somewhere along the way, there's going to be some type of gap, some type of space in between the expectation of the other person and what they actually do, okay? Examples of this. I expected you to do this, and you actually did this, right? It's pretty easy to think about. I expected you home at 4 o'clock, and it is now 4:30, right? You said that from now on you're going to help with the chores, and the chores are not done, right? You with me here? You could probably give me a few to throw out there. You promised that you would call him, and he's still not called. You guys relate to this at all? No gaps in your relationships? Then we're done. I mean, we're good. But at some point in every love relationship, really in every relationship, but especially in romantic ones, there's going to be this gap from what was promised and what was delivered, right? And in fact, it probably, honestly, if I was going to put this gap a little bigger, I'd probably move it maybe over here, right? Let's make the gap a little bigger. Would that be helpful for you guys to think through? Okay. I'm not getting much feedback here. All right. Now, here's the choice. Here's the choice that I was referring to a little bit earlier, right? In every one of these gaps, we put something. We do. We either choose to believe the best, or we choose to assume the worst. That's what we do. Every single time, we either believe the best, well, she's been busy. Well, he's done so much this week. You know, that's believing the best. There's got to be some reason for why this happened. Or assume the worst. Well, he's not paying attention to the clock. Or she probably called her sister, right? I mean, who knows what's happening over there? Or he doesn't know how to handle money. He's proved again he can't do this, right? Assume the worst. And we default to one or the other, right? Believe the best, assume the worst. Now, before we go any further in this discussion, I know that there's some conversation going on in some of your minds. Okay, Pastor, I think I see where you're going here. I see the gap. In fact, I see it all the time, every day, right? But I disagree with where you're going. The problem is not how I respond to the gap. The problem is that there is a gap, right? So if he would just get on the stick and get his behavior to match my expectations, I wouldn't have a problem with how I respond to the gap, right? I think we assume, actually, as we get into this conversation, that in order to stay in love, that we have to somehow avoid this gap. We have to avoid it. We have to somehow, maybe it's on this end, maybe we have to have more realistic, better expectations, right? Or maybe on the other side, maybe we just got to get him to do the right things or her the right things, and then everything would be just fine, right? But here's what I want you to hear. When you find people who are still crazy in love, you will not find couples that do not have a gap. There is always a gap somewhere along the way. There's always a gap. What you will find are couples that have decided, that have learned, that have made it a habit of assuming not the worst, but believing the best. Do you think that's true? Well, there's this book. Just give you a little bit of evidence here. There's a book called The One Thing You Need to Know. Isn't that a great name for a book? It's by Marcus Buckingham, and in this book he cites this study that was done. They were looking into couples that were unhappy, and they were trying to discover some details about unhappy couples. And they found out that every unhappy couple that they researched with, they seemed to not have realistic expectations of one another. And so those expectations were causing them to be dissatisfied with each other. So that sounds a lot like, it's not the gap that's the problem. I mean, it's not my perception of the gap that's the problem. It's the expectations or maybe the behavior, right? But then they did a study on happy couples. And they assumed going into the research that they would find that happy couples were the opposite of unhappy couples. That somehow that these people, they would have a strong understanding of each other, that they would have a really good realistic idea of expectations, and they were really understanding what kind of behavior might come out of that. And that's what great relationships were about. But what they discovered was surprising to them. They actually discovered the opposite to be true. They discovered actually that happy couples, they have very unrealistic expectations of each other. They do. In their study, husband and wives, they rated their partners much higher than the partners rated themselves. Just as an example, the man would take a test, he would rate himself in certain areas, and then they would give the same test to his partner, and in every single category, in happy couples, they actually rated the other person higher than they rated themselves. They were truly blind to their spouse's deficiencies. So within this study, they found this spiral of love. And it all begins with what they call the spouse's positive illusion. They actually used the word illusion. I mean, this is good stuff. Now, before you think this is really weird, before I start talking about this spiral here, this is the way you treated each other when you fell in love, right? I guarantee you did not see the faults of the other person when you fell in love, right? This was intuitive to you when you fell in love. Somewhere along the way, you lost this habit. But this is real stuff, right? Back to the findings. The illusion creates a conviction. They actually believe that they really are who I think they are. And then the conviction leads to security. Man, they're so great. I can trust them, right? And then that security, it fosters intimacy, and intimacy into love. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Now, here's the conclusion of the study. A husband or wife who assumes that his or her spouse possesses strengths that they don't think they possess in themselves will have a strong marriage. Isn't that a weird thought? In a marriage where I assume my wife possesses strengths that she doesn't think she has, that's a sign of a strong relationship. And this is the advice that they gave from the study. Find the most generous explanation for each other's behavior and believe it. Think about that. Find, come up with, be creative, search until you discover it. Find the most generous explanation for each other's behavior and then believe it. That's mind-boggling stuff. To stay in love, you must choose to believe the best. Not eliminate the gap, not have more realistic expectations, not keep on them until they start doing what you told them to do. Their conclusion from the test was that love is truly a little bit blind, and that happy couples, they don't have realistic views of the other person. They somehow give the benefit of the doubt to the other person, believing the best. What we put in that gap will determine whether we stay in love. Let me ask you, where do you go with this gap? What's your natural response? Do you go quickly negative? Or do you assume the best? As soon as you get the text, I'm going to be late, right? What's going to happen in your mind? Are you going, Arr. Or are you okay with that? Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Pastor, you just don't understand. If I just had a few moments with you to explain what my spouse is like, what my situation is like, my thoughts are completely justified. I mean, if I could just have a moment of your time, you would put your stupid little signs away, and we'd have a real conversation. You need to hear my sad story. Now, to be honest with you, I'm kind of in the business of listening to sad stories, and I've heard a few. And I may have even heard a story that might trump yours. I don't know. I'm not trying to make light of this. This is the world that we live in. This isn't easy. This is difficult, right? And I'm not being naive about this. I don't think Paul's being naive about this. The truth is that there are actually at least two things that make it difficult for us to believe the best. Number one is what you see. Number two is who you are. Number one, what you see. That's pretty simple, right? You haven't shown up yet when you said you should. You would. You see that I'm late, right? And it's probably not going to turn out well, right? What you see makes it difficult for believing the best. Number two, who you are. We had this conversation last week, right? We all bring baggage. We all bring beads into the conversation, into the relationship. The relationships that you've had in the past, they affect, in most cases, infect your heart, your ideas about relationships in general. What you've experienced, your hurt, your pain, your joys, what you saw growing up, what you experienced in previous relationships. I mean, all those things, the insecurities, whatever it was, they bring thoughts and ideas into our relationships that make it difficult to believe the best. I mean, both of those things, what we see and the way we are, impacts, doesn't it? And because of what we've seen in our current relationship and the baggage that we brought into it, it's really, really difficult. That's reality. And the reality is that some of us here assume the worst. We do. You don't like it when they, whatever. It starts gnawing on you, and it starts this kind of cycle of negativity, right? When both of you are there, think about that. If you're feeling negative and they're feeling negative and it's just getting worse, I mean, it just feeds on itself, doesn't it? And the fact is that when you live into negativity, you get to be right most of the time, right? Some of you like being right with your spouse messing up. See there, I told you that's the way it was going to happen. I told you you'd mess that up. See? And we actually get into the cycle of actually celebrating our spouse's failing. Right? Going back and forth, celebrating what you did wrong, celebrating what you did wrong. But do you remember what the goal was? The goal is not to be right. The goal is to stay in love. I mean, you may win arguments, but you'll lose the most important relationship you've ever had. I mean, you may stay safe, but you'll lose the intimacy. You may stay together, but don't you want more than that? Let me tell you something about the person you love. The last thing they want to do is disappoint you. The last thing they want to do is disappoint you. Now, maybe further down this cycle of negativity, you're both hating each other. I mean, we've had that conversation, right? But I don't care how bad the relationship is. I don't care what the history is. The last thing they want to do is feel that you're disappointed with them. Okay? No one wants to disappoint anyone. Doesn't feel good. This is what happens. When you go into negativity, when you start that cycle, what it communicates is no matter what you do, no matter how hard you work at it, you'll never measure up. You'll never measure up. You will never hit the standard. You will never get where I expect you to be. And every time you communicate that, what are you doing in your relationship? You're pushing them further and further and further away, right? And in your mind, you're saying, well, all he's got to do is make sure that he performs. All she has to do is get rid of the disappointment. Just do it, right? So jump higher. Be more careful. But that kind of attitude towards your relationship does not decrease disappointment, right? Instead, what you're doing is creating a cycle that eventually leads to you hating them more than any other person on the planet. So where it goes. Or at least completely numb to each other, where you're just kind of coexisting, not in love. It's not what we're after. So how do we get out of this cycle? Well, one of the most powerful things you can do in your relationship is to choose to begin to fill the gap with believing the best. What you communicate when you fill this gap with believe the best is, I trust you. I trust you. Even before I hear the explanation, I trust you. Even before I know what the circumstances are in this situation, I trust you. And when you choose to believe the best, even when there's a pattern of not performing, right? When you choose to believe the best, and when you choose to communicate that with the person that you love, here's what happens. It creates margin in the relationship. It creates space. It creates some opportunity to move in the right direction. When we believe in the best, you're giving the other person room to take responsibility and not just feel like a total failure all the time, right? And here's how it sounds in real life. Honey, I'm running late. Well, that's okay. I'll be right here waiting for you. Who stole my wife? Who stole my husband? What's wrong with you, right? All of a sudden, you've created some margin. Honey, I forgot to pay this bill. Well, instead of, aha, I told you you'd be horrible at this, right? Instead, you're saying, oh, you know what? It's okay. You've had so much on your mind. We'll get through this together. Margin. Margin, right? Margin. But I'm disappointed. No. Margin. You know what that does in a relationship? It says, come my way. Move my way. Yes, there's a gap, but instead of taking advantage of this gap to prove a point, I'm going to use this gap to leverage just how much I love you. Just how much I care about you. The more gaps there are, the more opportunities I have to say, you know what? But I love you. I love you. I love you anyway. I'm not giving up hope. I'm enduring all things, right? I'm bearing all things. I'm hoping all things. I'm believing all things. Come my way. Come my way. Our hearts are drawn to trust, acceptance, love, grace, mercy, right? When I know that you believe the best in me, when I mess up, I'm drawn to you, right? Now, I'm not saying you're not going to have difficult conversations. I'm not saying that you should just ignore the realities of the relationship. You're going to have some hard conversations. But when that conversation's over, when everyone's had a chance to clear their minds and share what they're thinking, at the end of all that, even if someone's still mad, you still make the choice to to choose to believe the best. Now, with that in mind, listen to 1 Corinthians 13 again. 2,000 years old may be the key to your love relationship. Verse 7, love always protects. What is love protecting? Love is protecting the integrity of the relationship, right? I'm not looking for opportunities where you're going to be a failure. I'm going to look for opportunities where something good is happening, right? Positive things. I'm looking for a way to keep my love alive. I'm protecting this relationship. Always trusts. Looking for a generous explanation, right? Hopefully there's a good explanation, but if there isn't, I'm not going to give up hope. Maybe even after I've given up hope, I'm going to try to give up hope, not to give up hope, right? Always perseveres, always looks for the good. Fact is, when you assume the worst, even if there's plenty of history to back it up, every time you choose the worst, you have contributed to the demise of your relationship. You are a participant. Every time you choose not to protect, trust, hope, persevere, even when it seems to be justified, even when there's a history, you are hurting the relationship. But every time you choose to protect, trust, hope, persevere, you're helping your relationship grow towards love. Relationships that last, relationships that thrive, they choose to believe the best. So the question this morning, maybe questions. Will I be willing to endure all things? Will I be willing to hope all things? Will I be willing to believe all things, to bear all things? Will I give them the benefit of the doubt? Am I willing to place in that gap, I trust you? Until there's absolutely no other way for that to happen, I'm going to trust you. And even beyond that, I'm going to try to trust you. What will you choose? Can two people fall in love and stay in love, happy together forever? Yes, if they make love a verb. If they're willing to mutually submit. Yes, if they're willing to put the other first, to value them, to be interested in their interests. Yes, if they're willing to keep watch over their own hearts and not play the blame game. And yes, if they're willing to believe the best and refuse to assume the worst until it's impossible to do otherwise. You believe you can stay in love forever. I believe you can stay in love forever. In fact, I think that's God's will for us in relationships. I think God plants that in us to desire that. And if you will submit to his plan, you may just end up there. It's going to take some work, right? What's the first step? Some of you have some restarting to do. You've built into your relationship some not so great habits. Could it start with maybe a conversation? How about we just give this a shot? How about we give each other some grace upon grace upon grace as we try to relearn some of these things in our relationship? As we try to retrain our thoughts and responses to each other. Can we offer each other grace in that? Can we have that as a common goal? Do you think that's possible? Would you stand this morning as we close the service?